Please start. We are live now.
Um, Thank you very much for being with us today, and we would like to offer our special thanks to our panelists for their time and being with us today. And we would like to also thanks to all attendees for their time and for their interest. And before we continue with our webinar today, I would like to invite Dr. Abdulmejid Hamouda for giving the introductory speech and the welcoming speech for today's webinar. Yes, Dr. Hamouda. Your microphone.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's session. Today, we are discussing a very important topic, actually, when we talk about supply chain disruption and food security. And this is something really we need to rethink about because of what happened recently and because of other issues. Today, in today's event, we have lined up a very distinguished speakers. We have Dr. Jessica from Johns Hopkins University. We have Dr. Tariq from HBKU. And we have Sarah from the Ministry of Municipality and Environment, and we have Dr. Hawari from Qatar University, and we have Dr. Saud from Qatar University, and the event is going to be moderated by Dr. Murad. I expect the discussion going to be very enriching, and I wish you all a very successful event. From the numbers I see in front of me at the beginning of it, is going to be a very successful event. So wish you a good luck. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abdulmejid, for your introduction. And actually, we have really great guests. And before starting with the webinar, I would like to just in a very brief, I would like to introduce them to our audience, and then later we will our program. And as mentioned in our invitation, today mainly we will talk about the supply chain disruption and the food security, and we would like to rethink about the crisis from the food and security perspective. And we have 6 panelists today, and the first panelists from we have 6 panelists from the Dr. Jessica Fanzo, Sarah Al-Malki, Tariq AlAnsari, Dr. Mohammed Hawari, Dr. Saud Ghani, and finally me. Also, I will be serving in the panel. And in brief, we have Dr. Jessica from the Johns Hopkins University, and Dr. Jessica is a Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of Global Food and Agricultural Policy and Ethics, and Director of Johns Hopkins Global Food Ethics and Policy Program, and also the team leader for the high-level panel of experts for food systems and nutrition for the United Nations Committee on Food Security. And she is also editor-in-chief of Global Food Security Journal Elsevier. And Dr. Jessica also has many expertise related to the food and security, and we just listed some like linkage between agriculture, the environment and climate, and how to improve the food systems and environments, diversity and quality of diets, and nutrition of outcomes. So we are very happy and honored to have Dr. Jessica with us today. And the second speaker will be from Qatar Ministry of Municipality and Environment. Ms. Sarah Al-Malki is an Assistant Director of Qatar Food Security Program, and her main expertise are on National Food Security Program development support and also sustainable food sector in Qatar. And thirdly, we have Dr. Tariq AlAnsari, Assistant Professor of College of Science and Engineering from Hamad bin Khalifa University, from the Sustainable Development Program, and Dr. Tariq AlAnsari's expertise are energy, water, food system, life cycle assessment, systems engineering, and resilience. And we have from Qatar University 3 speakers: Dr. Mohammed Hawari, the professor of Department of Mechanical and Industrial Engineering, from Qatar University, and Dr. Hawari's expertise are modeling and solution of complex industrial engineering problems, operations research, supply chain management, and optimization. And Professor Saud Ghani also will join from Qatar University. He is the professor of Department of Mechanical and Industrial Engineering Department at Qatar University, and also he has food-related expertise like food security and technologies, agricultural greenhouses in hot and arid environments. And finally, I will also serve in the panel, and I am also faculty of the Department of Mechanical and Industrial Engineering Department at Qatar University, and I am also mainly working on sustainability assessment, life cycle assessment, and global supply chain analysis are my main expertise. After this short introduction about our panelists, I would like to start our webinar with Professor Jessica from the Johns Hopkins University, and we are really would like to understand the global perspectives of the pandemic, so that how the pandemic is really affecting the global food security worldwide. And we already have some local experts from the Qatar, but starting with a global outlook will enlighten us today, Dr. Jessica.
Great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be with such a distinguished panel of experts who probably know much more about the COVID crisis and its impacts on the food supply more than I do, but I'll get us at least started and present a bit of the global picture. I'm not showing any slides because we don't really have a lot of data yet on the impacts of COVID on the global food system. We're still, of course, in the very early stages of really understanding this COVID crisis and the potential shocks to the food supply. Of course, we all on this panel have seen food shocks, food system shocks. You can think of climate change as a long-term, slow, and getting faster shock to the food system. What makes COVID so remarkable and shocking is how fast the world has changed. Many people working on this panel have worked on food supply chains, have dealt with issues around climate change, hunger, malnutrition, and never have those topics garnered so much attention and global governance action as COVID has in a matter of 4 months. It's really an unprecedented moment, isn't it? So it's interesting to be thinking that we're in the middle of a significant crisis where every country is impacted, but we're still trying to develop the data of how it's affecting local communities and countries. So I think we have a lot of lessons from the past. We've had food supply disruptions that have resulted in historic moments and conflicts. We can think of the Arab Spring as being a very important moment that was linked to food, linked to many other things, but we can think about many historic times of where food shocks or food disruptions have created societal changes. So when we think about the COVID pandemic, we still don't really understand its origins and its spread and how it's impacting food systems in all of their complexity and connected ways. But we know that food systems and food supplies are starting to buckle. They're starting to change. And it's really starts with, we have a lot of food in the food supply. We have cereal harvests have been quite strong this year. The stockpile of certain commodities like maize and rice are quite stable, but it's a matter of time to see if that food can be moved around the world, and the prices of those foods, and where people can access food. So while the food supply stockpiles are quite stable at the moment, that could change quite quickly depending on how long this COVID crisis goes on and how long we're all at home and in lockdown. And I think one of the things that's really starting to show is the supply chain in between. It's the movement of food. It's the laborers who are unable to get to fields and harvest crops. It's the processors that are able to go to factories, process food. We're seeing that in the United States with many meat packing processors getting sick. We see a lot of ships being docked at ports because they cannot disembark. So we have a lot of supply, we have a lot of demand, and it's not meeting. So maybe you're hearing a bit about farmers having to bury crops, or in the UK, they're dumping dairy into the waterways because they just can't move the foods, they can't move the commodities. So the food supply is showing its vulnerabilities. The second area is food access. We are all at home, and it's becoming more challenging to access food. Curfews, lockdowns, closed markets, open air markets being particularly vulnerable to being closed, where many people shop, long queues, increased prices, shortages of your favorite foods or staple grains are starting to show. And there's a bit of panic buying, there's hoarding, there's food bank queues, where people are being fed on a daily basis. So we're really seeing on the consumer side and citizen side, food access issues. And the last is the most vulnerable. There's a deep concern about acute hunger and malnutrition. We've made progress over the last decade in driving down hunger, driving down child malnutrition. And estimates from the United Nations World Food Program, they're estimating an additional 265 million people will become hungry by the end of this year due to COVID. And that is devastating and quite significant. But I think within all of these challenges, we have an incredible moment for opportunity. We, as a global community, those of us who work in food, we have to act now, we have to coordinate, and we have to deal with the situation that we have. So we really need to put in safety nets, food safety nets, food protection programs for the most vulnerable to avoid hunger numbers going up. We have the capacity, the programs, and the platforms to build on those safety nets right now and avoid catastrophic hunger. The second thing is we need to get the food supply moving. It's an essential good. We need food to survive. We need it to live. We need to allow for supply chain logistics to work. Farmers need to get technologies and inputs to be able to grow food. Workers need to get to fields to harvest. Storage facilities need to be able to stock food and move food. And processors and packagers need to be protected. None of this can be done if we don't protect the workers. Personal protection equipment, social distancing within these places where they work. This should be our number one priority, is getting that food supply functional and moving. The third area is really, we need to understand the origins of this disease to avoid another future pandemic. We need to understand that ecosystems where animals live are driving a viral spread because wildlife habitats are being threatened and affected by land use changes and deforestation. Agriculture expansion to grow more food is driving that. And trade for wildlife is common and found often in these wet markets in many parts of the world. So we really need to understand how to avoid these zoonotic diseases and spillover effects that we've seen with many other previous diseases, SARS, MERS, COVID, Ebola, avian flu. We're learning lessons, but we need to now take action. One of the things we need to do is really develop better coordinated, global coordinated systems around tracking potential zoonotic diseases. And obviously the WHO and other organizations are pivotal to thinking about how to develop a better coordination around avoiding future pandemics. And just last, and it has nothing to do with the food system, but has everything to do with the food system, we really need to keep our health workers safe. We are still in the midst of this COVID pandemic. We don't know when we're coming out of it. If we start to go back to work, we're potentially going to see more cases again. And this will overburden the health system and once again have an impact on the food system. So we really need to protect health workers along with our food system workers to avoid what could be an even more catastrophic situation that we have at hand. I'll stop there, and I really look forward to hearing the other panelists and the questions and discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Jessica. It was a very interesting point that you talk about the workers, and also you touch upon some components of the supply chain. And from some past speaks that you deliver that I was listening also, you were talking about a holistic food system policy that can also help the countries to tackle with such kind of crisis. And I'm really curious that how this pandemic, because you mentioned about the workers, you mentioned about the producers, you talk about the healthcare workers, and I think it's a very highly connected system. So the countries, they have agricultural policies, some food policies, but as we see, the problem is really systemic problem, which needs quite an integration of different stakeholders. So that how the pandemic, I'm really curious, that can also lead to a better systemic food system in the world. So that is really, we wonder to hear about it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I, really no country has a holistic food system policy that brings in the economics, the environment, the climate, the health, the education system, the gender aspects. Many countries have agriculture policies or dietary guidelines, but having something holistic that brings together many ministries to work together is challenging, but potentially could be important in moments like this when you have something like COVID that impacts every sector and impacts every system. And food being so critical for our survival, our traditions, our culture, it's one of those areas that brings together all of those important facets of development of a country. And so to me, it's an incredible opportunity to rethink our food policies in the context of COVID, because we're really seeing the vulnerabilities across different systems and how food is relating to those different vulnerabilities.
All right, excellent. Thank you. Thank you for the answer. Hopefully at the end we will revisit Professor Jessica with some other discussions and interesting questions. And at this point, we would like to also hear from, we start with the global perspective, and we learn the concept of COVID-19 and in the relation in a global context and food security. But we also have very important guest from the Ministry of Municipality and Environment, and Sarah Al-Malki. She will talk about the Qatar Food Security Program and it's how it really helped country at this moment to become resilient to the COVID-19, and also how the self-sufficiency, which has been achieved for several sectors in the past, also helping the Qatar for this crisis time. So that, Sarah, we would like to also hear from you regarding the food security program and its relation with the COVID-19.
Thank you so much, Murad. And I'd also like to thank Qatar University for organizing this webinar and for having me here as a panelist. I just wanted to make sure that everyone can see my presentation here.
Yeah, it's excellent. It's clear.
Yeah, I'll talk about the Qatar National Food Security Strategy and how that has helped mitigate some of the supply disruptions that we've seen in the past 3 to 4 months. So the Qatar National Food Security Strategy was implemented or put in place in 2018, shortly after the blockade that we've experienced from our neighbors. And what was so this blockade was sort of like a blessing in disguise, I want to say, because we've managed in the past 2 years to work on some pillars that have helped us mitigate some of the risks that we're currently facing today. And I'll go over these pillars in a bit. So the strategy focuses on 4 main pillars, which are international trade and logistics, domestic self-sufficiency, strategic reserves, and domestic markets. And under each of these pillars, we have a number of initiatives. Today, I'm going to focus more on the international trade and logistics and the strategic reserves pillars, as these are basically the topics of our concern for today's discussion. So the first pillar, international trade and logistics, basically looks at ensuring that Qatar's food import strategy is resilient against potential trade shocks and disruptions, and that Qatar can quickly react to the loss of trade partners or in a drop of self-sufficiency. And this pillar has 2 main initiatives under it. The first one is to diversify our trade partners and ensure that we have no less than 3 to 5 partners per commodity, and also to ensure that the share of imports from any of the partners does not exceed 35%. The other initiative that falls under this pillar is contingency planning and ensuring that we put in place plans that limit the impact of trade shocks or other disruptions in the country, and ensuring that these contingency plans have been tested and tried by the importers. So these are just some of the commodities or critical commodities that we focus on for trade diversification and contingency planning. And I want to talk a bit more about the importance of trade diversification, especially for Qatar. So we see here that we have 2 different graphs, one for critical perishables and another for non-perishables. And if we look at the perishables graphs, we can see that the current source of imports for tomatoes, for example, in Qatar, falls, or the largest share of imports of tomatoes comes from Iran. And what we're trying to do here is ensure that we have a more diversified and balanced trade between our different trade partners. And to ensure that should anything go wrong with Iran, at least we have other sources of imports for these critical commodities. And another thing that I would like to point out is that due to the limited shelf life and cost of coal transportation for perishables, we need to ensure that the countries that we choose to import these perishables from are not too far away from Qatar, as the transportation time for perishables cannot exceed 14 days. Whereas when we look at non-perishables, it doesn't matter where we choose to bring these products from, because at the end of the day, non-perishables can last us a long while, and they don't require special modes of transport or coal transportation. And so we can bring these in from Canada, Australia, Russia, and still, if it takes 2-3 months for them to get here, we still would not have any problems with them. But we do need to ensure that our trade is diversified, the share of imports is diversified between our different partners. The next strategic pillar is domestic self-sufficiency, and here we look at ensuring that Qatar produces perishables competitively, and to shift towards best practice technologies and drive yield improvement. So this pillar has 4 main initiatives under it. The first is to increase vegetable production by 70%. The next is to expand and improve the production capacity of red meat and fish. The third initiative is to cap the production of fresh milk and poultry, because currently our production is exceeding our demands. And so we need to ensure to shift the additional capacity to other purposes. And the fourth initiative here is to reduce groundwater-based fodder production by switching to recycled water. The third pillar is strategic reserves, and this is another pillar that I want to focus on a bit more today. And this pillar basically puts in place reserves to act as a buffer against temporary imports or production disruptions, and to act as an insurance policy against longer-term shocks to the system. So we have 4 initiatives under this pillar, and I'm only going to focus on the first 2 since they're related to critical commodities. So the first initiative is to leverage the private sector to store a broad range of products and act as a permanent short-term buffer against the system. And the second initiative is to put in place strategic reserves for non-perishables as an insurance against potential trade and production disruptions. So what we're trying to do here is we'll have 2 different types of reserves, the short-term reserves and the long-term reserves. And what we've done in the past 2 months is a law has been already implemented by the Ministry of Commerce and Industry that has enforced the private sector to provide coverage of reserves for at least 2 months for the whole population for critical perishables. So we're lucky that we've already worked on that before COVID-19, and the law was implemented right during the time where COVID was, at its peak here. And then the other use of reserves is as a long-term insurance policy, and we're still working on this initiative where we are going to be producing or ensuring a reserve of 6 months for critical non-perishables for 75% of the population, as well as a 6-month reserve for agricultural inputs in order to help mitigate any risks we may have in local production. And the last pillar that I'd like to talk about is domestic markets, which basically brings transparency and efficiency to the food supply chain by ensuring fair commercial practices in the whole of the value chain, and reduces waste in the supply chain and ensure better quality for end consumers. So we have 3 initiatives under this pillar. The first one is to put in place a farmer support program, which has already been done. The company is Mahasil, it falls under Hasad Foods. And basically, Mahasil ensures transparency in the price setting process and assists farmers in improving their productivity. The second initiative is the food waste program, which we are going to focus on hopefully in 2021. We were supposed to focus on it this year, but due to COVID-19, things have shifted. So hopefully by next year, we'll be able to establish a food waste program that will include the collection and treatment of organic waste and hopefully reduce food waste in the country by 5 percentage points. And then the last initiative is basically a food standards governance or a food standards agency, which is currently falls under the mandate of the Ministry of Public Health. And this agency will be set up to monitor food safety in the country and to supervise quality certification more effectively. And lastly, I just want to show the different partners that that have worked with us on drafting and implementing the strategy. And we can see here, so we have 5 different pillars. I've only spoken about 4. The last pillar is R&D and human capital. And when it comes to international trade, we're basically working very closely with the likes of Ministry of Commerce and Industry, the Customs Authority, Qatar Chamber, Hamad Port, Hasad Foods, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So we have a large number of partners that have helped us implement some of the strategies and helped us mitigate some of the risks that we're currently facing. And I think this is it for my presentation, if there are any questions.
Thank you very much, dear Sarah. It was a very detailed presentation regarding the security and food security program in Qatar. And actually, I would like to learn from your experience, because this food security strategy has been developed before the pandemic, and it is developed for the period between 2018 and 2023. Of course, the embargo happened in 2017, also resulted in a lot of important benefits and also opportunities for Qatar. And right now there are self-sufficiency in many of the sectors, food sectors that's happening. So to this end, can you please a little bit elaborate more on how this food security program strategy also helping Qatar currently to cope with the current pandemic? So what are the still, is there any topics or points that this strategy should be adjusted, or it is really answering the current questions related to the COVID-19?
So I guess we were lucky in the sense that we have already worked on, for example, contingency planning before this pandemic happened. So when the COVID-19 happened and there were some supply disruptions in our value chain, we were able to mitigate those because we had already put in place some plans, and we knew what other routes to take and which other partners and countries to start getting into talks with to import the goods that we need, the commodities that we needed to import. So during the coronavirus pandemic, we haven't really come up with new ways of dealing with it, because everything that we're going through today is just basically very similar to what we've gone through in the past. But we were lucky to have already been ready with a plan. We had a plan in place. We had our strategic reserves were already put in place. What we did during Corona time was, or during March, was we introduced that law that enforces the private sector to start storing reserves for 3 months at least for critical commodities. So that wasn't in place with the private sector before Corona. It happened only in March, and before COVID-19, the reserves fell under the public sector. So what we've done here is, in order for the public sector not to basically spend extra costs on storage and warehouses, we've managed to get the private sector on board and help us with this. And another thing, so it was strategic reserves that we've worked on, the contingency planning, and luckily the supply chain within the country was not really disrupted. So we were able to get our goods from the ports and into the retailers, like business as usual, basically. So yeah.
Excellent. And actually, the numbers are also interesting, because after the GCC crisis, the Qatar ranking in global food security indexes also get higher. And in 2019, globally, Qatar is listed among the top 20 countries in the world regarding the food security index. I think that strategy is also helping tremendously for the country. I would like to just, before switching to next speaker, lastly, I would like to also combine some points from the Professor Jessica from the Hopkins. She mentioned that we need to protect the workers. We need to protect the farmers, as we are trying to also protect our healthcare workers, because these people are very important for delivering the healthcare services. And similarly, is there any strategy currently ongoing in the ministry, or you are planning on that or working on that, you are also planning to develop some points that you can support the farmers and protect their healthcare and support them financially, and also support their health conditions? So is there any policy that you are already working on that, or you already did?
Yes, so we're currently working on digitizing our market systems in order to ensure, safety amongst our workers, the farmers, and if any, and also to ensure that the products can go from the farmers to the consumers without having large, groups of congregations or markets and all of that. So we're working on digitizing a lot of aspects of these farmers markets, and we're also we've closed down a lot of the markets that have been in this that we used to have in Qatar. So like the wholesale markets has been closed down, and we've segregated the market so that each market focuses on a certain commodity. So, for example, in Salal, the market there focuses on fish. There's a fish market in Salal. There's a vegetable market in, I believe it's in Al Wakra. And so each different farmers market is basically focused on one specific commodity in order to try to minimize the number of crowds that go to these places. We're also spreading or providing gloves and masks to the workers in these markets and ensuring their safety during this time.
Excellent. Thank you very much, dear Sarah, for this great presentation. And the next guest, Dr. Tariq AlAnsari from HBKU, and we know that Dr. Tariq is also mainly working on food security, food sustainability, energy, water, food nexus, which is quite also interesting because the problem, as also mentioned by the Professor Jessica at the beginning, which is a systemic problem, needs an integration of different stakeholders and different systems, so that we would like to also get some reflections from Dr. Tariq regarding this crisis.
Thank you very much, and thank you to QU for inviting me. And it's a pleasure to virtually meet all the panelists, those that I haven't met before. Pleasure to meet you, and those that I know. Nice to hear from you again. And I'd like to thank all the participants for making the time to join us in this webinar. Hopefully you all learned something and we all learned something together. So thank you once again. The title of the talk, Rethinking, or the title of this webinar, Rethinking Food Security and Food Supply Chain, is very timely, because defining food security is always evolving, and it's evolving because the situation in the world is evolving. So as that changes, defining what food security means will change accordingly. And it's a complex system in a complex world. So it's very difficult to ensure that we have a fully functioning food system because the situation in the world is uncertain, difficult at times, and we need to continuously adapt. There's constant externalities affecting the food systems, and it's specific from one region to another. Traditionally, food security considered accessibility, availability, and utilization. But today, more and more, the importance of stability in the food system has become more apparent. And that's because of the number of externalities has increased accordingly. And we know this, sitting here in Qatar, we know that we are affected from the supply chain perspective, because a couple of years ago, we had a political disruption in the supply chain from our neighbors. This was a diplomatic disruption. From a political perspective, there could be wars that take place, and they affect supply chains and result in disruptions. Health-induced supply chains, which results in lockdowns, and people can't go to work, people can't transport products. So you're unable to move not only food, but the different inputs into the food system. This is some of the things happening today, but more and more we will see other externalities, negative externalities, like population growth driving the increase for demand for food, and in addition, climate change. What we may find in the future, countries which were traditionally known to be exporters may find that they no longer can export anymore as much food, and their contribution to the global market will decrease. This could be because of the resource constraints, local population growth, and this will affect the supply chain. So risks and externalities will always take place. And what we need to do, I think, is three things. We need to understand where we are, and the ministry, as it's just highlighted by Sarah, is doing a great deal of work in understanding where we are in terms of our food security status. And not also this, but we need to develop the mechanisms to monitor. What does this mean? Well, first of all, we need to have all the pillars in place that talk to each other. We have the supply chains, the domestic production, the strategic reserves, but they need to continuously talk to each other and be able to complement each other at any given time to address the complete food system. But in addition to this, in terms of the monitoring, we need to develop risk profiles. Risk profiles for not only the products that we produce, but every single input into our food system. We may be self-sufficient in one product, but if the input into growing that particular product is affected from the supply chain, then we are unable to grow this product. So, for example, if we are 100% self-sufficient in X product, but a critical material is coming from abroad, it will be affected by the same supply chain. So we need to develop risk profiles for all the crops that all the products that we are growing and consuming, and understanding from a domestic production perspective, what's the risk profile, and from a supply chain perspective, what's the risk profile of their dependencies, and then develop adaptation mechanisms. Well, then, okay, fine. If I have a particular commodity and associated inputs, which has a high risk profile, I need to develop a diversified strategy to ensure that at any given time, the whole life cycle or the whole value chain of this product is able to be met constantly. And then through this diversified supply chain strategy, we need to perhaps look more into the collaboration mechanism. How do we collaborate with our global partners to ensure that at any given time we avoid the notion of competition or try to rethink our participation in the supply chain and go from a more collaborative mechanism to from a more competitive participation to a more collaborative participation to ensure that we can use diplomacy and global trade to enhance our domestic food security. So that's just a summary. I think the previous speakers gave an excellent summary of what's happening on the global context and what's happening on the local context, and connecting the two is very important from a food system perspective, and managing the externalities and developing risk profiles is, I think, very important for any country that desires to be food secure. I will stop there. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Tariq. The message was very interesting from you. I think you start from the local perspective and the local supply chain, and also emphasize the importance of the global impacts, because we are very connected in the world currently, or through the import and the export mechanisms. And today, like specifically, we are struggling with the pandemic currently, but tomorrow maybe we will continue to see the severe effects of the global climate change that will also bring us other kind of crisis related to the food system, because like a food system itself is consuming almost 78% of the fresh water and the 30% of the energy, the worldwide, so that which is also having a lot of pressures on the ecological system. Before moving to next speaker, I would like to just ask you that the food security problem is a problem where it's a systemic problem. Like it has different components: environmental components, social components, economic components, societal and governance components. So that the life cycle thinking and the nexus thinking. There are two kinds of thinkings that are used to model such kind of problems. I would like to also ask you how these two approaches, system thinking approaches, can help us to tackle the global food security issues.
Thank you for the question. I think it's an important topic because previously, in the decades that passed, there was an intensification of agriculture production to meet population growth, to meet the demands from a growing population. Perhaps, and most likely, there was little regard for the sustainability component. But I think going forward, we need to intensify agriculture production to meet key pillars of security, but we need to do so sustainably because you need to think about the generations to come. We may adopt a strategy that achieves food security today, but if it results in a problem elsewhere within one of our sectors further down the line, then perhaps we need to address this point today. That's why I think it would be important for any strategy that any country adopts to take a life cycle approach to consider your value chain from production all through to consumption. What are the raw materials that are being utilized across the value chain? Are they secure in terms of where they're coming from? And if they are produced or sourced locally, is it sustainable in utilization? And in terms of the energy, water, food nexus approach, I think it's a good approach to adopt when addressing food security problems because not all countries have the same proportion of energy, water, and food resources. Some countries are very rich in energy and, in fact, very poor in water and don't have arable land, whereas some other countries have huge amounts of water but little energy. So it's important that you grow and you address your resources collectively such that you don't neglect any particular resource when you are promoting the security of one. So the energy, water, food nexus is a collective promotion of all three resources to ensure that at any given time, you're okay and secure from all three perspectives.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you, dear Tariq, for this enlightening talk. And it was very important to especially discuss the importance of thinking local, of acting local, thinking global, and understanding through the COVID-19 that we are all connected and the supply chains are all connected. We are open economies, and sustainability thinking and assessments should consider the regional and global supply chains at the same time. It was a great message, and that was very important to understand. The next speaker, Professor Mohammed Hawari from Qatar University, from the Department of Mechanical and Industrial Engineering. And Dr. Mohammed today particularly will give us a very valuable information about what is the supply chain, what is the resilience, and what is the disruption. Yes, Dr. Mohammed.
Thank you, Dr. Murad. Thank you very much. Thank you for all participants. And it's a great pleasure to be with such a great panelist. So I'll be talking about resilience, the concept of resilience in global supply chains. So if you ask any supply chain manager what is his motto, what is his main goal, he will probably explain that it's distributing the right quantities to the right locations at the right time. This is the perfect, the ideal scenario. But unfortunately, we are not living in a deterministic world. So there are plenty of uncertainties, plenty of unpredictable events that may lead to unpleasant situations. For instance, we may experience delays, shortages, or in some extreme cases, even chaos. And chaos is probably what we are observing since few months with the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. Sadly, up to today, it caused more than 320,000 deaths. But for curbing the spread of this pandemic, most countries imposed lockdown measures. So maybe 100 countries around the world imposed these lockdown measures. When you say lockdown measures, what does it mean? It means that most workers will be staying at home. Most plants and logistic facilities will be shut down, and borders and airspaces will be closed. This is exactly what is happening since 2 or 3 months. And obviously, this has a very, very negative impact on supply chains. Supply chains are seriously disrupted, and in many cases, they are broken down. So what we witnessed during the last months is that thousands of plants across the world were closed. Why? Because they cannot get their parts, which were coming from China, initially from China. China is one of the main suppliers of parts throughout the world. For instance, the US are importing about maybe more than 35% of the intermediate products are coming from China. This is also the case for Japan, South Korea, and many, many countries around the world. So when we say supply chain disruptions, it means that it translates into shortages. And this is exactly what we observed during the last weeks. So it became very difficult finding, for instance, tablets, laptops, smartphones. So all these stuff that enables us to work, to rework from home. So they were all in short supply. So very difficult to find a smartphone, very difficult to find all this kind of electronics equipments. But not only, it was also, unfortunately, also hard to find some staple products, very difficult to find pasta in many countries. So we experienced many food supply shortages. And the situation apparently can become even more dramatic with a global food crisis that is looming. And Professor Jessica talked about that. So the situation is very known. This bad situation is very known for the medical supplies, because we also heard stories about countries that were struggling, nearly fighting to get personal protective equipment, diagnostic tests, medical care, and so on. But what about pharmaceuticals? What about the drugs? Unfortunately, the situation for drugs also is critical. Absolutely worrisome, extremely worrisome. So why? Simply because the vast majority of what we call the active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs, the APIs are those molecules that are used as the basic constituents for crucial drugs, so including antibiotics, anti-cancer, anti-diabetic painkillers, medicine that treat cardiovascular disease, and so on. And the vast majority of these ingredients are imported from where? From China. Most of them are imported from China. Actually, it's interesting to know that China provides between 80 to 90% of the global percent of these active ingredients for antibiotics. Without these ingredients, it's not possible to manufacture, to produce any antibiotic. And here we are talking about life-saving antibiotics and medicines used for surgery. Rosemary Gibson, she's the author of the book that was dealing with the America's dependence on China for medicine, wrote, when you control the supply of medicines, you control the world. Actually, the last manufacturing plant to make penicillin closed in the US was shut down in 2014. And about the same thing happened in Europe also as well. And why? Do you know why? The reason is very simple. Actually, no one else can produce such huge quantities so cheaply. And here we come to a very important aspect, cost, the cost aspect. It's important to know that so far, the mainstream paradigm in supply chain management is that competitive advantage could achieved through two main pillars. First, achieving efficiency, which means achieving the lowest possible production and distribution costs. And second is achieving high responsiveness, which means achieving very short lead times. So we witnessed during the last 2 decades maybe to a frantic race towards cost reduction, which means that relocating plants to countries with cheaper labor costs, and usually these countries are located far away from markets, minimizing the number of production facilities and building large-scale, specialized, highly focused production plants. Why? So that we can achieve economies of scale, and also aggressively reducing any excess of capacity or inventories. Both are considered as waste. This is perfect. In so doing, we can achieve low costs, but it's important to understand that this put the supply chain at risk. What kind of risk? Let me give just one example. Do you know what is the tazocine? Okay, before preparing these slides, I didn't know it, but now I know that this is a very important antibiotic, which is used in hospitals throughout the world. And in 2016, there was an explosion in a plant manufacturing this product. Unfortunately, this is the only plant in the world producing this product and supplying to hospitals worldwide. It means that hospitals in UK, Europe, Qatar, everywhere in the world witnessed or experienced shortages of this vital drug. Can you believe it? Just one plant for producing one of the most important antibiotic. So we easily understand that focusing solely on reducing costs leads to highly vulnerable supply chains, because major disruptions seriously impact the flow of materials or break the supply chain. There are plenty of disruptive risks that we need to consider, actually. I will not go through all of them, but very quickly, we need to monitor and control all kinds of risks. For instance, terrorism, natural disaster. By the way, with terrorism, on September 11, 5 plants have been closed for a long time. Natural disasters are occurring with a high frequency, with the global warming, with all what you are witnessing in the global for the changes. We are witnessing more and more natural disasters. For instance, the earthquake and the tsunami that hit Japan led to a massive collapse in the global automotive and electronic supply chain. Toyota, by the way, lost its market leadership position and never recovered it. There are plenty of other possible risks, man-made risks, strikes, legal contract disputes, and so on. So what is important is that when designing a supply chain, we should not only focus, as we usually do, put emphasis on cost and responsiveness, but also we need to emphasize resilience. Resilience is extremely important. So what is resilience? What do we mean exactly by resilient? What's the difference between resilience, robustness, and so on? So in physics, resilience is the capability of a strained body to recover its size and shape after deformation caused by compressive stress. But generally speaking, you are resilient. A person, for instance, could be resilient if you are able to recover quickly from difficulties, knowing how to cope in spite of setbacks, barriers, or limited resources. In our case, for supply chain, the supply chain will be resilient if it's able to maintain, execute, and recover a executed plan. In other words, if it is less vulnerable to unpredictable disruptions. We can build resilient. So there are several stages. I'll not go into the details, but very quickly, there are some proactive actions that need to be taken, which are preparedness to disruptions, mitigating risks by building what we call robustness, stabilization, and recovery. I don't think I have enough time for going through the details, but preparedness, I would say, means risk monitoring, going through different risks, continuously, thoroughly analyzing and monitoring these potential risks. And putting robustness or building robustness means that basically it's based on building redundancy. So add some resource excessiveness, have some excess material inventory, capacities buffers, and liquid assets also, which is important. Proactively also, we need to build flexibility, which is the ability of supply chain to change itself quickly. And this can be achieved through several ways. So very quickly, through flexible production systems, using modular standardized products, multiple plants and located in scattered geographical regions, not all of them in one country, one single country, like we are doing now, using multiple sources and so on, multiple mode shipping and so on. Information also is extremely important. Actually, without information is actually the main one of the most important drivers in achieving resilience. With an integrated IT system, we may achieve resilience. It will enable coordination, and it will also implement effective implementation of recovery plans. We can use three of the most promising IT technologies, which are artificial intelligence, IoT, and blockchains. Artificial intelligence, for instance, could be used for continuously collecting, analyzing data, and establishing early warning systems, and also suggesting quick, prompt decisions and recovery plans. Using at an extensive scale, IoT will enable to track and monitor every single part of the supply chain as they transit through the supply chain. And using a blockchain, which is a distributed database, which is shared among all stages of the supply chain, will enable to ensure visibility, transparency, and security. However, it's important at this stage to emphasize that resilience comes at a cost. And it's very important to find a good trade-off between resilience and cost. We can use all kinds of techniques that we know, optimization, simulation, and so on, and try to answer to some of the most strategic and so most crucial issues, like, for instance, what should be the optimal level of redundancy? Just for concluding, I would like to emphasize once again that it's so important now to rethink supply chains by making them more resilient, and we should never assume that the current disruptions will never happen again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mohammed. It was a really excellent presentation. And what was also very interesting today, that you already made a very great contribution, because as you mentioned in the supply chain management books, basically when we open them, we usually see that the supply chain is trying to increase the supply chain surplus and the minimizing the cost and increasing the profitability. So that's quite interesting to understand that this formulation is quite missing the social costs, which is currently we are experiencing. And basically, you suggested some kind of paradigm shift in contemporary supply chain management literature, that we should also include resilience in addition to efficiency and response. That will make the overall food supply chain more and more robust and resilient. I think this is one important takeaway from today's presentation. Before moving with our next speaker, one question that I would like to ask, I think this crisis is still an opportunity to understand all the bottlenecks. And we as a world also understand that we are not that much resilient, we are not that much responsive, and we are not that much efficient. And in this stance, we definitely need to understand the overall system and in a holistic way. From this point, I would like to just ask that we have logistic disruptions, we have the disruptions on the local production from the farmers, And we have the consumer sides that they are not consuming enough, that is creating another economical, let's say, problem for the world. So how do you see the crisis or the pandemic as an opportunity to reshape our supply chains to become more resilient?
I think then when most supply chain managers realize the big mess that they found them, where they found them today, of course, they need to reconsider. This will make them, it's a kind of a shock, actually. And it put at risk, and it's threatening many companies, actually. We expect that maybe thousands of companies will go into bankruptcy for a very basic reason that they were not designed to be resilient. I think they have no other issue but to think about resilience. I would like to add also one fourth pillar. I didn't have time to elaborate on that, and the context doesn't enable it, which is sustainability. So also to build sustainable supply chains, which is closely related to some extent to resilience as well. So this is, I think it's a good time for rethinking our way of life, and its way of, as engineers, for instance, as industrial engineers, so focusing on essential aspects and not only on cost and responsiveness and high quality as we used to do so far.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Mohammed. It's a
very
interesting and very enlightening talk. And we have our next available guest, Dr. Saud, and he's waiting for us for a long time. And Dr. Saud will also talk about the challenges, I think, the design challenges, especially in the local system that are also affected by the COVID crisis. And we would like to also hear from what are the impacts on the pandemic on the local production challenges, and also how we can increase the national capacity in terms of the better production and resilient production. Your mic is off, Dr. Saud. Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah. It's nice to be the last speaker. So most last speakers, a lot of people will not pay attention to what they say, but I promise you that it will be short. I am going to give a perspective of somebody that is research all the time in the field. We work in food security long ago, even before the blockade. In Qatar, maybe for the last eight years, we're working in food security and how we can produce local products in Qatar, sustainable with less cost. As Dr. Hawari said, cost comes into the question. So if I just share a couple of slides. So I want to share one important slide that hopefully summarizes all what we've been talking about. So at the end of the day, I need to just mention one thing, that pandemics all the time are there, but you as customers and the society, because of the lockdown, is the first time that you feel it. So for example, we have avian flu came from birds. We have swine flu coming from pigs. We have the SARS as well, and coming from meerkats and the rest of it. And we have, when we go to the farms, there is a season for foot and mouth. So all the time, producers have pandemics, and they have to face pandemics either in the form of viruses or even in form of pests like fly fruits and other viruses that can eat the whole crop can go off to the drain because of the care that they need to put into either looking after the animals or looking after the products like the agriculture, the plants, and the rest of it. So pandemics are always there, but it's the first time you as a consumer are feeling that strain, because your freedom is restricted. But producers all the time, they have to deal, like I said, with avian flu. They have to deal with foot and mouth. They have to deal with other pests like fly fruits and fruit flies and the rest of it. But this is your supply chain in one slide. So one side you have the producers and the farmers, and the other side you have the consumers, which is yourselves. So all what we discuss now is always about consumers, how we can get food to the consumers, how we can make the supply strategic buffer in order to look at if there is a disruption of anywhere there in this system, the consumers will not feel the pain. But the problem is you have to look after the farmers, the producers. The producers now, their supply chain is disrupted. If somebody is using a greenhouse to give up products like tomatoes or cucumber, they need cocoa peat, which is being produced in Sri Lanka, for example, and they have to be transported all the way from Sri Lanka to here. They need some fertilizers that will come from Japan or from China. They, if they are dealing with animals, they need some vaccines against diseases, and they need some hormones to generate growth or whatever. So at the end of the day, supply chain is not only concentrated in the consumers, and that's what we've been discussing now. Don't forget the whole system. The whole system is a balance. We have here a balance, a scale between the farmers and the consumers. This supply chain is not only between the farmers and the consumers. The supply chain needs to go back to the farmers. We need to support their own supply chain of vaccines, medicines, and other products that they need in order to make this cycle go. So for farmers, they need to look at like sorry, it's going this way. Okay, so for farmers, they need guys to look at using new science and technology to, if you want to, for example, to produce in the middle of summer in a place like Qatar, and you have to pay a lot of money to keep a cucumber plant happy and productive, or a plant tomato happy and productive, or even milk. Keeping the dairy cows in an environment like Qatar during the summer without having thermal stresses, and at the same time, because the thermal stresses would be reflected in the mood, and it would be reflected on the productivity of these cows, and even the milk quality, it would be reflected on that, and the feed and the rest of it. So all this will go into the farm economy. At the end of the day, a farmer is a businessman. Farming is business. They need to make money. So that's why I can produce cucumber in Qatar in the middle of the summer, but it will be like $3-4 just to pay for the energy and water. Remember, all these needs water. So when Jessica said the farmers in UK, they put the milk into the drains. Yes, they put the milk into the drains because they cannot transport them. And at the end of the day, milk is water with some proteins. So a lot of water went into the animal, which is the cow, in order to produce that milk. So milk is water. Cucumber is maybe 90%, 85% of it is water. So you need to make sure that you have the technology in order to give a high crop, a high yield, and then make that farmer making some money. Is not doing this farmer is not doing it for the god and the queen. At the end of the day, it's a business, and they need to have return in their investment. So you have to look at as well as the farming system, what farming system that they are going to use. So money needs to come back from there. But how much energy? I know energy in Qatar and water in Qatar is subsidized, but for how long? The amount of land being exhausted by farming, you need, especially in a landlocked Qatar, you need to make a lot of land treatment in order to do open agriculture, and how this will affect the climate change. So at the end of the day, you take that food, either straight food or processed food like cheese and the like, and it goes to the consumer. The consumer will pay the money and goes back to the farmer, with the people in the middle will make some money as well, the food processors, distributors. So all this will come into whatever Sarah was talking earlier about, which is the food security and the civil security, and this will be guarded by the policies and the politics and governance that the government will make in order to make organize the relationship between consumers, food industry, and farmers. All this as well should feed into like values and knowledge and preferences for the consumers. So, for example, will these farmers can use some form of genetically modified food? Can we use treated effluent water and feed it to the consumers? So you can make good products, but because of the technology you use into developing these good products, maybe the consumers as well, they are not going to accept buying these genetically modified foods, or if you treat your cows badly, so the ethics about dealing with animals, you have a lot of ethics here. Customers we have the ethical customer who will not buy from a company like Nestle, for example, because they feel that, or KFC, because they feel strongly about the way that they deal with their animals. So, and again, we have the socio-culture as well. They are affecting how the consumers are within this supply chain. So we have the environment and we have the demographic, and in between it's a very, very fine scale between supply and demand. So, for example, in Qatar, before the blockade, we've been like His Highness the Emir said, رب ضارة نافعة, that for every cloud there is a silver line. So when the blockade happens, a lot of effort was going into about how we can do food security and put mitigation plans in order to facilitate this particular movement or supply chain. So now we have an overproduction of poultry, eggs, and dairy products. So before we have shortage in dairy products, we have only milk. Now we have milk, milkshake, chocolate milk. We have yogurt, different kinds. We have cheese, different kinds. So even the farming industry, they started to have some innovation about not just producing a one-off product that goes fresh to the consumer, but because they have surplus, what to do with the surplus, how to extend the shelf life of these products, and look at the transportation as well. And what is important is the waste. Again, how we can take the waste, the organic waste, and put it back into the farming industry and make sure that we can use this waste. So it's a very fine, balanced system. It's a scale between supply and demand, and how we cannot, food security is not about producing everything locally and feed it to the local community, because you cannot do that. You cannot produce like in Qatar. Number one, you don't have the land. It would be very expensive in water and energy, but at the same time it wouldn't make sense to be 100% self-sustained and everything you produce in your land. So, but at the end of the day, you have to have the basic line, the threshold between how much you can import from outside. And Sarah done some statistical analysis, and she gave us some from the ministry. She gave us some the monitoring of the amount of produce that they take from abroad, and how much they can produce locally, and the steps being made in order to increase the amount of produce locally. So this one, I call it the food system map, and it will give you the whole basic elements between the farmers, the producers, and the consumers, and that fine balance. So what we can do, guys, we can look at different technologies in order to produce that. We talked about digital agriculture, like using the Internet of Things, like using artificial intelligence, having intelligent smart robots that they can selectively spray pests, and they can cultivate, and everything there. You have to have a controlled thermal environment, like vertical farming, storage and packaging, and food processing and treatment. Instead of just having meat, you can do other processed types of meat or fish. You can do other process type of fish to extend the shelf life, distribution and transportation, maintenance, and what is important is waste management. That's very important. So what when we looked at this, it's very good to look at countries which is similar to Qatar, what they do. So for example, how they can securing, sourcing, and supply chain and food storage and management. They look at all year having a stable production of what we call the basic vegetable agriculture, which includes cucumber, capsicum, and tomatoes, and aubergine. This can be produced all year round. How we can, for example, in food production systems, use an integrated food production system like aquaponics and the like, water purification techniques, water management and irrigation techniques, waste prevention and management. That's very important. And then you can look then at a 10 years plan on ocean agriculture, digital agriculture, green fertilizers, and biodegradation of these fertilizers. And then you have another longer term plan for soil, especially soil, because of Qatar soil is very harsh. So soil building technologies like microbiome based, large scale open field. In Qatar, we have during winter a very good season to do outdoor farming, outdoor agriculture using current land, and then meat and how we can do the a production of that meat. And you can see here every line is a supply chain going forward and backwards, and you need to make sure on the supply chain, not only for the customers, for the farmers. Very important to keep that. This is one take you can take from my talk, that supply chain is not only concerned about the customers, about the farmer. If they don't have their vaccines, if they don't have their pesticides, if they don't have their media that they do the plants on them, if they don't have their like the equipment and the maintenance, they wouldn't be able to produce anything, and the rest of the supply chain is disrupted anyway, because the start of the supply chain is not able to put any packaging through the system, if you like. This is number one. Number two, that pandemics happening all the time, but we as customers, the first time to feel the pain because of the lockdown. But I mean, SARS, avian flu, that all the time people who deal with animals, they have these problems. Like foot and mouth is seasonal, and when you go into the farm during the season, you go through whatever you're going now. They take your temperature as well, and you go into through a sanitizing machine, and you put special clothing which is being sanitized in order to go to the farm and deal with the animals. So again, pandemics happening and will happen, and happened in the past, and it just been reinventing itself in order to come with a new type of pandemic. But we need to deal with it as well. And with that, I thank you for your time. I was quick, I think.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saud. Very on time. We still have around 7 minutes, actually. And in the meantime, we are also having questions from the audience and the participants today. And it was quite interesting to discuss these cases of the farmers. And also Qatar is, you are coming also from the farm time to time. You visit and you understand also the problems from the also before. And Qatar has the open farming, greenhouse gas farming, and also hydroponic systems. What is it, like one last question to you? How do you see these systems can also help the resilience of the Qatar, and which one looks like the more sustainable way of producing the food for the country?
Qatar has been blessed with the winter season. I mean, believe it or not, it's in the middle of the desert, and you can see we have asparagus in winter time. We have aubergine. During the winter time, we do tomato plantation in net houses. So the net, we do a big greenhouse with a net, but that net is there to protect against the pest like flies. It's not because you need to create a microclimate. That's why a diversified 2 seasons plantation in Qatar will be good. And our problem is during the summer season. So for example, in summer season, if a plant like tomatoes, its temperature increase from 28 degrees C, you'll still have a healthy plant, but your production will go down to maybe 2 kilograms per meter cube because of the pollen is being going foul because its temperature is more than 28 degrees C. That's it. So you'll have a healthy plant, but very few fruits because you lost the flower. The pollen in the flower gone cooked basically, and it wouldn't germinate. It wouldn't give you a fruit. So in order to do that, you need to make sure that its temperature will not exceed 28 degrees C. And to do that, you have to use a big mechanical power like air conditioning, similar to you sitting in your house. And this will give you resilience, but at which cost? That's the other problem. At which cost? So when you go, we said it's a relationship between farmer and the customer. So I cannot give the customer and say, here you are, I've got you 1 kilogram of tomatoes. It cost me $10, for example. Why? Because of the cooling package I gave you in summer. It makes sense to buy from Iran and other countries during the summer because you can get it to the consumer at a lower price. But at the same time, if the country said, I need to have a basic need from supply of tomatoes locally, even during summer, then you need to go and look at technologies to make that cheaper. You bring that 1 kilogram of tomatoes from $10 to $5 to $4, and you use then innovation. So nowadays we have a new type of greenhouses. We plant in cold stores using solar cells in order to collect sun rays and beam it on the plants during summertime, and we managed to reduce that last summer and this summer to $2 per kilogram from $10 per kilogram in cooling. So it was really about using technologies that we have in order to have solutions for a local problem that could be taken to Africa, to India, and help fighting the global hunger, as Jessica was saying. Because if you are a country like Qatar and you reach a type of fine tweaking of production and you solve the problem of hot summer, you can then scale that up and give it to other countries free of charge as a knowledge in order to fight hunger globally.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Saad. It was very clear and also informative presentation. We are coming to the end of the seminar, but we had some questions to our guest from United States, from the Dr. Professor Jessica, which is also quite interesting question, because we know that Professor Jessica is also expert in healthy diet, local food, and the nutrition. And the audience is asking that, Dr. Jessica, we are right now mainly staying at home, and we are not consuming the food outside. And we are especially gaining weights at home, consuming the food. And we are also not wasting as before, because we are mainly cooking at home most of the time. And people are trying to buy from the local farmer markets because of the proximity, and also the some supply chains are already disrupted. To this end, how we can see the impact of the pandemic on the nutrition and the healthy diet of the households and the people?
I think it's a great question. And I think all of us have experienced our dietary changes. And I think more people, that probably younger people, are trying to cook people are baking more, people are getting into their kitchens, and but with that, there's the issues of the kinds of foods that you want access to is a struggle depending on where you are. It's not as easy to get certain products or certain commodities, and it's harder to always get fresh food. So, there is some data coming out that processed packaged food consumption is going up. People are buying the staples, and it's harder to get those fresh, perishable foods. But, again, I think it really matters depending on where you are and who you are and your ability to be able to pay for food. So there's places in sub-Saharan Africa or in South Asia where people are struggling now to meet caloric needs. So I think it really depends. But I think for some individuals, it's getting harder to eat healthier, and for others, they're actually eating healthier because they're cooking their own food. They're not eating out every night. They're not eating street foods. So what I hope will come out of this is that more and more people learn how to cook, because I think we've lost those culinary skills, and people watch cooking on TV more than they actually do cooking. So so it might be an interesting time to see how old traditions come back in where people are actually cooking again and being self-reliant. But again, I think it completely depends on where you are and your access to food. But it's a great question. Yeah.
It's very interesting. Actually, I also see many people, they say during the pandemic time, we really improved a lot in terms of cooking at home, not wasting a lot because we have the lockdowns and we will not be able to buy the food again. So that I see from some kind of improvements in terms of the people habits on the consumption of the foods at home and cooking at home, and also trying to minimize some kind of wastage. That is quite also interesting. But at the same time, people are also more tend to use their lands to plant some food. Some governments all over the world, they already start helping the people, for example, especially also in Turkey, that is, they give some kind of incentives to people to plant some kind of vegetables and the products that they can also grow their own products. I think from this perspective, the pandemic gives some kind of opportunity for us to think about our overconsumption and unsustainable consumption of food and other resources. And maybe, as mentioned by the Dr. Mohammed, that will also improve the resilience of the food supply chains, because most of the food products are also wasted before we reach them in our table. So the less we consume, the less waste will also be happening within the overall food supply chain. Thank you, Professor Jessica. It was a great pleasure again to have your reflections. I think at the moment we are around 10:33, and I think with the US time it is 3:33. It's over 3 p.m. And at this point, I would like to leave the floor to Dr. Abdulmejid Hamouda, our Associate Dean, for making the concluding remarks and sharing his opinion.
Thank you, Murad. Thank you for excellent moderation of the event. I would like to thank all our panelists. I think it was really an enriching discussion. I would like also to thank all our panelists, and we are sorry that we couldn't take all the questions because of the time, but we promise you that we take a note, and I'm sure there will be future. I hope they will not really webinars, they will be physically face-to-face, that's where we can tackle this issue again. So thank you, and stay safe, stay at home, and have a wonderful night. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Hamouda. To this end, we again thank all the presenters and panelists, and also the participants for their time. And we would like to also wish a very holy night of Qadir. And hopefully we will be meeting, as Dr. Hamouda mentioned, face-to-face after we beat this pandemic.
Dr. Murad, I think just one note. I think we have more than 120 participants both at WebEx and YouTube. So it's really shows the interest of people, and we hope to have more of such wonderful webinars. Thank you again, and have a good night.
Have a good night. Thank you very much. Have a good night to all.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jessica. Thank you, Dr. Muhammad. Thank you, Dr. Saud. Thank you, Dr. Tariq and Sarah. Thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Murad. Okay, have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you, Faisal. Shuja, thank you for your support.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much.